All right, so we're diving into 1 Timothy today, specifically chapter 5, verses 1 through 25. Uh, on the surface, it might seem like just a list of rules, but I think if we dig a little deeper, we can see how this early Christian community was actually functioning.
Yeah. It really is like looking through a window into their lives, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Like their daily lives and struggles.
You know what I find fascinating? It's how Paul, the writer of this letter, blends practical advice with these deeper theological principles.
Hmm.
He's not just giving Timothy a checklist, right? He's actually trying to shape how Timothy leads this community.
Yeah, and he jumps right in, too, talking about how people should treat each other within the church, especially across different generations.
Yeah.
Older men like fathers, younger men like brothers. But then for the women, it gets interesting, right? Older women as mothers, younger women as sisters. But then he adds, with absolute purity. That last part really stands out to me.
It does, yeah. It makes you wonder if there were certain situations going on in Ephesus where Timothy was that maybe prompted Paul to give that very specific instruction.
Yeah, good point.
Remember, this isn't just an abstract sermon, right? It's a letter addressing real issues these people are facing.
Okay, so thinking about that real-life context, how do you think those instructions would have landed with the people hearing them? It's so different from how we interact today.
I know, right? Imagine telling people that today. But back then, maintaining clear boundaries between men and women, especially within a religious community, was likely super important for, well, respectability, and to avoid any hint of scandal.
Makes sense. So moving on, we hit this whole section about widows, and wow, it gets surprisingly detailed.
Oh, yeah.
Paul really draws a distinction between widows who qualify for support from the church and those who don't. He talks about a widow indeed, someone truly desolate and relying on God.
And it's interesting because he links that reliance on God with being devoted to prayer. It's like he's saying true faith isn't passive, It's active. It's a constant conversation with God.
That's a great point. But then he also says that if a widow has family, their care falls on the family first.
Yeah.
It's like this personal responsibility before community support thing.
Exactly. He even says later in verse 8 that neglecting to provide for your family is worse than being an unbeliever. Strong words. It really highlights how intertwined faith and family were for them.
Totally. It wasn't just about believing the right things, but actually living it out in your closest relationships, taking care of your own. So let's dig deeper into who does qualify for that church support. Paul gets super specific here.
He does. He lays out all these criteria. At least 60 years old, a one-man woman, a reputation for good works, raising children, showing hospitality, even, get this, washing the feet of saints.
Wow.
It really paints a picture of what active, involved faith looked like back then, right? Not just sitting in the back pew.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it makes you think about what those good works actually meant in their society, right? We take things like, I don't know, washing machines in senior homes for granted these days. But back then, caring for the sick or elderly was seriously demanding hands-on work.
It was. It's a good reminder that well, the way we express our faith today is shaped by our own context and resources.
Yeah.
What might have been considered basic Christian duty back then could translate into very different actions today.
That's a great point. Okay, so we've got these widows indeed who are eligible for help. But then Paul tackles younger widows, and it takes a very different turn.
Oh, yeah.
They aren't eligible for this support, and his reasons are, well, they're pretty interesting. He's worried they might remarry and abandon their commitment to Christ. Or even become idle gossips.
There's that word idle again. Seems to really bother Paul. This idea of people not being productive members of the community.
I wonder why.
And remember, remarriage back then wasn't just a personal choice, right? It had huge implications for your social standing and economic stability, especially for women.
Right, of course.
So, yeah, lots to unpack there.
So instead of supporting these younger widows, Paul encourages them to remarry, have kids, manage a household, basically stay busy and productive.
Yeah.
It really highlights how differently marriage and family were viewed back then. Almost like a safeguard against temptation or, idleness.
It definitely challenges our modern sensibilities. I mean, we might read it today and think, wait a minute, isn't that limiting women's choices?
Yeah.
But if we try to see it through their lens, through the lens of their time, I think it's more about, fitting into those societal expectations.
Okay, shifting gears from widows. We get some instructions about church leaders, the elders. And again, there's this balance between honoring them, especially those who are good teachers and preachers, and holding them accountable.
Yeah. Paul even quotes scripture to support this idea that they deserve compensation for their work.
Oh, yeah.
He says, thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn, and the laborer is worthy of his reward. But then there's this whole process for handling accusations against them. It requires multiple witnesses, not just hearsay.
Which is interesting, right? Because it shows they weren't just blindly accepting accusations against their leaders. They were trying to protect people from slander
Yeah.
while also making sure that, that legitimate concerns were addressed. It's almost like an early form of due process.
Exactly. And this commitment to fairness also comes up in verse 21. Paul tells Timothy to make decisions without any bias or favoritism.
Right.
Justice was clearly a central value in this community.
Absolutely. It's almost like he's anticipating potential problems and say, hey, don't let power go to your head, Timothy. Treat everyone fairly. So after all this serious stuff about leadership and accountability, we get this little detour into personal health advice for Timothy himself.
Oh, yeah.
The classic, drink a little wine for your stomach.
It always makes me chuckle. It seems so random in the middle of all this.
No, right.
But it's actually a great reminder that these instructions weren't just about lofty ideals. They were about navigating real life.
It also humanizes Paul and Timothy, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like they weren't superhuman figures. They had health issues, digestive problems, just like us.
Right.
But they still had to carry on with, the work of leading the church.
Yeah. And it reminds us that even amidst all the challenges and complexities, sometimes you just need a little wine to help you through,
Yeah. Okay, so before we move on, I want to highlight verses 24 and 25. It basically says that everyone's true character will be revealed eventually. Your actions, good or bad, can't stay hidden forever.
It's a powerful thought, isn't it?
It is. It's like this underlying message throughout the whole letter. You can't just talk the talk. You have to walk the walk. Your actions will ultimately speak louder than words.
And it adds a whole other layer of accountability, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Knowing that, eventually, everything comes to light. It's almost like a spiritual law of cause and effect.
That's a great way to put it.
So what comes next? Remember that passage we were looking at about widows? The part that contrasted the widow indeed with those who are dead while they live?
Yeah, that one really stuck with me. Seems kind of harsh at first. But the more we talk about it, the more I see what Paul is getting at.
Right. He's not saying that all widows who, enjoy life or remarry are somehow spiritually dead.
Right.
It's more about their underlying motivation and the choices they make. It's about widows who are using their situation as an excuse to indulge themselves and abandon their faith.
So it's about like a disconnect between their outward actions and their claimed faith. Like they might say they're devoted to God, but their lifestyle tells a different story.
Exactly. It's that same theme of authenticity and integrity that we see all through this letter. True faith isn't just a label, it's a lived experience, reflected in your choices and actions.
And it really challenges this assumption that just because someone is a widow, they automatically deserve support from the church.
Yeah.
Paul's making it clear that it's not about your marital status.
Right.
It's about the state of your heart, your commitment to actually living out your faith.
Which brings up an interesting point about how the early church viewed suffering.
Oh, how so?
Well, today we often try to avoid suffering at all costs, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
But back then there was this idea that suffering could refine your faith, bring you closer to God. It wasn't something to be feared or avoided.
So for these widows, it wasn't just about their material needs,
Yeah.
but also about their spiritual well-being. Like maybe Paul was concerned that by becoming dependent on the church, they might lose that sense of reliance on God that he sees as so crucial.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like he's encouraging them to find their strength and security in their relationship with God. Right, not in their social standing or financial support. And it reminds us that true faith isn't about comfort or ease. It's about trusting God, even in difficult circumstances.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about that passage in verse 22 about laying hands suddenly on no man. It's talking about appointing church leaders.
Yes, exactly. Laying hands was a symbolic act in the early church, often used in ordination.
Right.
So Paul is cautioning Timothy here to not rush into appointing leaders without careful consideration. Don't just hand out these leadership positions to anyone who I don't know, seems enthusiastic or charismatic.
Because if you do, you become partaker of other men's sins, as the verse says. That's a pretty serious statement.
It is. It highlights the weightiness of spiritual leadership.
Mhm.
Paul's saying that by ordaining someone who is unworthy, you share in the responsibility for their actions. You're essentially vouching for their character and their ability to lead the community.
So it's not just about finding people who can, teach or preach well.
Right.
It's about discerning their character, their integrity,
Yeah.
their commitment to living out the faith.
Yeah, and that discernment takes time
Ah,
and careful observation.
makes sense. And I think it's interesting that Paul links this idea of discernment with personal purity.
Oh, yeah.
He tells Timothy to keep thyself pure. It's like he's saying, you can't lead others effectively if you're not striving for righteousness yourself. Like your own life needs to be an example.
It reinforces that whole idea from earlier about action speaking louder than words.
Yeah,
You can't just preach about holiness if you're not living it out in your own life.
exactly.
Mm.
And it connects back to that spiritual law of cause and effect we were talking about.
Mhm.
Your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for those you influence as well.
That's a good point. Now, I'm curious, what do you think about verse 17, the part about elders who labor in the word and doctrine? What does that mean?
Oh yeah, it seems like there are different levels of leadership within the church.
Yeah, it does seem that way. Some elders were primarily responsible for governing the church, handling administrative tasks, making decisions. But then there were others who were gifted in teaching and preaching, those who labored in the word.
So it wasn't just about managing the church, but also about nourishing the community spiritually, providing guidance and instruction, like a pastor today.
Yes, very similar. And those who excelled in both areas, those who could lead and teach effectively, were considered especially worthy of honor and support.
Hmm.
Paul even says they deserve double honorarium.
That's fascinating. It shows how much value the early church placed on sound teaching and having strong, well-rounded leaders. It wasn't just about charisma or personality,
Right.
but about a genuine commitment to studying and proclaiming the truth.
Absolutely. It also highlights the importance of ongoing learning and growth for leaders.
Yeah.
It wasn't enough to just have a title or position.
Right.
You had to constantly be deepening your understanding of the faith, finding new ways to communicate it effectively.
We were talking earlier about how Paul's letter blends practical advice with theological principles. And there's this one verse that really exemplifies that, verse 23, where he tells Timothy, drink no longer water, but use a little wine for thy stomach's sake and thine often infirmities.
It always makes me chuckle. It seems so out of place.
I know, right? Like this little health tip tucked in between all these serious instructions about leadership and ministry. But I think it's actually a great example of how holistic Paul's approach to leadership is. He's not just concerned with Timothy's spiritual well-being, but also his physical health.
It's like he's saying, take care of yourself, Timothy. You can't pour from an empty cup.
Exactly.
And it reminds us that even, spiritual giants like Paul and Timothy were still human. They got sick, had digestive issues, just like us,
Right.
but they still had to carry on with the work of leading the church.
And it also shows that Paul wasn't afraid to offer practical advice, even about something as mundane as what to drink.
He recognized that every aspect of our lives, even our physical health, can impact our ability to serve God effectively.
It really brings the whole letter to life, doesn't it? It reminds us that these weren't just abstract principles. They were real-life instructions for real people grappling with real-life challenges. And sometimes, well, a little wine is just what the doctor ordered.
Sometimes, yeah.
Hmm.
Speaking of real-life challenges, there's another theme that runs throughout this chapter that I think is really important, this idea of false faith.
Oh, yeah.
We see it pop up in a few different verses.
Oh, yeah, like that line in verse 15 about some women turning aside after Satan. And earlier when it talks about widows who are dead while they live.
Exactly. Those verses suggest that there were people within the church who were claiming to be followers of Christ, but whose actions contradicted their profession of faith. It's like they had the outward appearance of piety, but lacked the inward transformation.
So it's a warning against hypocrisy, a reminder that true faith isn't just about words, but about a changed life.
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of spiritual discernment,
Yeah.
being able to recognize genuine faith from a counterfeit. Because as Paul points out, sometimes the most dangerous wolves are the ones wearing sheep's clothing.
And that discernment requires more than just surface-level observation.
Yeah.
It's about paying attention to people's actions,
Yeah.
their character, the fruit of their lives.
It's also about recognizing that even within a community of believers, there will be those who stray from the path.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a reminder to be vigilant,
Yeah.
to hold fast to the truth, and to encourage one another to live authentically.
Before we wrap up this section,
Mm?
I want to circle back to those verses we touched on earlier, verses 24 and 25, about how everyone's true character will be revealed eventually.
Yeah, such a powerful thought.
It is, and I think it connects to this theme of false faith in a really profound way.
I agree. It's like Paul is saying you can't fake it forever. Eventually the truth will come out.
Mm.
And that applies to both the good and the bad, right? Your hidden sins might stay concealed for a time, but eventually they'll be exposed.
Mm.
But on the flip side, your good deeds, even the ones done in secret, will ultimately be rewarded.
It's almost like a spiritual law of gravity.
Mm.
What goes up must come down.
Yeah, I like that.
And it adds a whole other layer of accountability to our lives, doesn't it?
It does.
Knowing that our actions have consequences, both now and in the future.
Absolutely. It's a call to live with integrity, to make choices that align with our beliefs, and to trust that God sees and knows all things, even the hidden motives of our hearts.
So as we move on to the final section of this deep dive, what stands out to you about what we've explored so far? What's resonating most with you personally?
I'm really struck by the emphasis on personal responsibility and accountability that runs throughout this chapter.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about what the church as an institution should do, but also about how each individual should live their life, take care of their own family and affairs. It's a reminder that faith isn't just about believing the right things, it's about living them out in a tangible way.
That's a great point. And for me, what's really powerful is that theme of genuine faith being demonstrated through actions.
Yeah.
It's a challenge to all of us, regardless of our role in the church or society, to live in a way that aligns with our beliefs.
It's a challenge, but is also an encouragement.
Right.
It's a reminder that our choices matter. Our actions have impact, and even the smallest acts of kindness and faithfulness can make a difference in the world.
It's like that ripple effect, right?
Ah.
Even our small choices can create these waves that impact those around us. And speaking of impact, something that really stood out to me in this chapter was this idea that even our seemingly insignificant actions have consequences. Like in verses 24 and 25 about how for some people their sins are obvious and for others they're hidden, but eventually they'll both be revealed.
Yes, exactly. And the good and the bad deeds, too, they will all come out in the end. It really makes you think, doesn't it? Like it's a universal law of accountability. You can't hide from your actions forever.
It's like that spiritual law of gravity we were talking about before.
Oh, yeah.
What goes up must come down.
I like that. It really adds another dimension to this whole passage, It's not just about following the rules to avoid being punished or something. It's about living with integrity because our actions, they really do have a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Both in this life and the next.
It's about recognizing that connection between like our inner lives and our outward actions.
Yeah.
Everything's connected.
Exactly. Now, before we finish up this deep dive, I want to touch on something that people often overlook in this chapter. In verse 19, where it says, "Against an elder receive not an accusation, but before 2 or 3 witnesses."
Oh, yeah. Talking about the importance of having multiple witnesses before you take an accusation seriously.
That's right. And while this might seem like just a procedural detail, I actually think it speaks volumes about the early church's commitment to fairness and due process. They weren't just blindly accepting accusations. They wanted to make sure that there was enough evidence before they took action against
It
someone.
was like a safeguard against slander or, false accusations, right?
Exactly. And this is still relevant today, especially in a world where information spreads so quickly online, right? Reputations can be ruined so easily.
Yeah, that's true.
It's a reminder to be cautious and discerning and to, not just jump to conclusions based on hearsay or rumors.
Exactly. And it really highlights the importance of seeking truth and justice, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, as we wrap up our exploration of 1 Timothy 5, what's the one big takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with?
For me, it's the understanding that this chapter is about so much more than just rules for an ancient church. It's like a timeless guide to living out your faith in a practical, meaningful way. It challenges us to think about our relationships, our responsibilities, and our own hearts.
I love that. It's like a call to action. not just a history lesson.
Exactly. So, as you reflect on these teachings, I really encourage you to consider how might these things speak to your own life, your own journey of faith?
Hmm.
What assumptions are being challenged for you? What new insights are you discovering? And how can you apply these ancient principles, well, to the challenges and opportunities that we face today in our modern world?
That's a great question for all of us to consider. It's been a fascinating deep dive into 1 Timothy 5, and I hope it sparks some new thoughts and reflections for everyone listening. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking truth.